The highway your father took to work every morning had a second purpose that nobody told him about. The overpass your mother crossed on the way to the grocery store was built to specific clearance measurements that had nothing to do with traffic flow. The wide median on the main boulevard through your city was not an aesthetic decision. Every major American city built or expanded between 1950 and 1975 was quietly designed with a parallel function that the people living in it were never informed of. The roads were evacuation routes. The buildings were shelter designations. The overpasses were built to accommodate vehicles that would never use them in peacetime. The infrastructure of ordinary American life had been mapped, classified, and assigned a role in a plan that assumed the worst, and that most Americans drove past every single day for decades without ever knowing it existed. The plan had a name. It had coordinators. It had classified maps. And it was built into the physical landscape of every major American city before most of their residents were old enough to drive. The story begins in 1956 with a piece of legislation that every American learns about in school, and almost none of them learn the full truth of. On June 29, 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, authorizing the construction of 41,000 miles of controlled access highway across the United States. The official justification was economic. Faster commerce, safer travel, connections between cities that would fuel American prosperity for generations. That justification was true. It was also incomplete. Eisenhower had seen what the German Autobahn accomplished for military movement during the Second World War. He had also overseen the first serious studies of what a nuclear attack on American cities would require in terms of civilian movement. The interstate highway system was designed for both purposes simultaneously, and the dual function was not hidden from the engineers who built it. It was written into the specifications. The engineering requirements in the original Federal Aid Highway Act: minimum lane widths of 12 feet, maximum grade percentages that kept heavy vehicles moving on uphill approaches, minimum overhead clearance of 14 feet on every overpass in the system, were not arbitrary aesthetic choices. They were calculated to accommodate military vehicles, including tanks and missile transport, and, when necessary, the mass movement of civilian populations out of targeted urban areas in a quantity and at a speed that no previous American road system could have managed. Eisenhower had watched the German Autobahn move armies. He intended the interstate to be capable of moving a nation. The Office of Civil Defense had been working on urban evacuation planning since the early 1950s, but the program accelerated dramatically after the first Soviet thermonuclear test in 1953. The original shelter-in-place philosophy, keep families in their homes, in their basements, behind their stocked pantry shelves, had been built around atomic weapons with yields measured in the tens of kilotons. Thermonuclear weapons changed the mathematics entirely. A 10-megaton weapon detonated over a major American city would produce a fireball large enough to vaporize everything within several miles of the detonation point and cause lethal overpressure damage across an area where no basement, no shelter, and no amount of stored food would matter at all. The only survivable response civil defense planners concluded by the mid-1950s was not to be in the city when the weapon arrived. The question was how to move millions of people out of American cities quickly enough to matter. The answer the Office of Civil Defense developed was called Crisis Relocation Planning. The premise was specific and, in hindsight, optimistic, that a nuclear war would be preceded by a period of rising international tension lasting at least several days, during which the government would have sufficient warning to order a voluntary evacuation of high-risk urban areas. Families in designated zones would be directed to leave their homes, drive assigned routes out of the city, and travel to pre-identified reception areas in rural counties outside the projected blast and fallout zones. Those rural counties, called host areas, had been surveyed, assessed for population capacity, and assigned specific urban populations to receive. Your neighborhood, if you grew up in or near a major American city, was assigned a specific evacuation route. That route was identified in a classified planning document maintained by your local civil defense office. And the road that route used was, in many cases, the same road your parents drove every day. The plan and documents that survive from the 1960s and 1970s reveal a level of specificity that is remarkable and, to modern eyes, both impressive and unsettling. Civil defense planners calculated the evacuation time for every major American metropolitan area under multiple assumptions: voluntary compliance, partial compliance, and the specific scenario of a Sunday morning evacuation versus a Monday morning rush hour evacuation, which produced dramatically different projections because of the difference in traffic patterns and the proportion of population already away from home. The calculations for Los Angeles, which had the most complex evacuation geometry of any American city due to its basin geography and near-total freeway dependence, projected evacuation times ranging from 18 hours under optimal conditions to several days under realistic ones. The Los Angeles plan divided the metropolitan area into color-coded zones, each assigned a specific freeway corridor, with departure times staggered to prevent simultaneous convergence on the choke points where multiple routes merged. New York's evacuation plan grappled with the unavoidable problem of bridge and tunnel choke points that no engineering decision could resolve. Manhattan's 12 bridges and 2 tunnels represented a fixed limit on outflow, regardless of how wide the approach roads were built. Chicago's plan assigned individual neighborhoods to specific interstate exit corridors and calculated the vehicle spacing required for continuous movement without accordion effect slowdowns. Every plan acknowledged, in language that planners chose with evident care, that the projections assumed levels of public order, fuel availability, and weather conditions that would not reliably exist in the actual event. Specific features of American urban infrastructure were built or modified with evacuation in mind in ways that have never been publicly acknowledged and that most Americans have never had reason to notice. The wide center medians on many American urban boulevards and state highways from this era, the ones that seemed unnecessarily generous for their traffic volumes, were designed in part as emergency vehicle staging areas and, in some designated corridors, as improvised landing strips for light aircraft needed for command and coordination during an evacuation. 1 mile in every 5 of the interstate highway system was originally specified to be straight and flat enough to serve as an emergency airstrip. The on-ramp and off-ramp geometry of many interstate interchanges from the 1960s was calculated to allow maximum vehicle throughput during a one-direction surge. Everyone leaving, nobody arriving, rather than the bidirectional flow of normal operation. Bridge weight ratings on designated evacuation routes were specified to accommodate not just civilian passenger vehicles, but military vehicle convoys that might be needed to manage traffic flow or provide security during a mass movement. None of these design decisions were advertised to the public. They appeared in civil defense planning documents and in the technical annexes of construction contracts, and then they were built into the ordinary landscape that your parents drove without a second thought for 30 years. The program reached its most elaborate development in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when the Carter and then Reagan administrations invested significantly in what FEMA called the Crisis Relocation Plan. FEMA published detailed guidance documents for local civil defense coordinators specifying exactly how the program would be activated, how populations would be notified, what routes would be designated, and how host areas would prepare to receive urban evacuees. The program assumed that American families, given 3 to 7 days of advance warning, would voluntarily leave their homes and drive to assigned rural reception areas where they would be housed in schools, churches, and community centers until the crisis resolved or escalated. The plan was studied, revised, and updated throughout the late Cold War period. It was never publicly explained to the people it was designed to move. The reason for this silence was not accidental, and the decision to maintain it was not made casually. Civil defense planners had studied public responses to evacuation orders in non-nuclear emergencies. The chaotic exodus ahead of hurricanes, the gridlock produced by industrial accident scares, the dangerous highway conditions created by wildfire evacuations with inadequate notice, and concluded that pre-announcing the existence of detailed nuclear evacuation plans would produce one of two unacceptable outcomes. The first was complacency. Families who knew the plan existed and had been told they would receive advance warning and official direction might reduce their own individual preparedness on the assumption that the government system would take care of them when the time came. The second outcome, which planners considered more dangerous, was anticipatory panic. Communities that understood their local infrastructure had been designed and built around the explicit assumption of nuclear attack might experience a chronic low-level dread that would undermine the social stability, economic productivity, and civic confidence that the program was ultimately intended to protect. The decision was made at the federal level and implemented consistently at every tier below it. Maintain the plans, update them annually, train local civil defense coordinators in their execution, and say nothing to the general public about what had been built into the landscape around them. Your parents drove the routes without knowing they were routes. The roads were ready. The maps were drawn. The reception counties had been surveyed and assigned. The people who were supposed to use the plan were the last ones told it existed. The Crisis Relocation Plan was formally abandoned in the mid-1980s, not because the plans were assessed as unworkable, though critics had made that argument extensively, but because the political climate had shifted against anything that suggested nuclear war was survivable or manageable. Congressional hearings challenged the program's assumptions. Academic critics published studies showing that the evacuation time projections were unrealistic under any plausible attack scenario. The program was defunded, The planning documents were archived, and FEMA shifted its civil defense mission toward all hazards emergency management. The roads remained. The medians remained. The bridge clearances remained. The infrastructure of an evacuation that was never conducted is still there, built into the ordinary geography of American cities, driven over every day by people who have no reason to know what they are driving on. Your parents drove those roads for 30 years. They did not know the specific calculation that had determined the lane width of the highway they used every morning. They did not know that their neighborhood had been assigned a route number, a reception county in a rural area they may have never visited, and a projected travel time that assumed a specific vehicle density and a level of public order that planners privately acknowledged was optimistic. They did not know that the overpass they crossed 3 times a week had been built to 14 feet of clearance because that was the minimum a military vehicle required, and that the same clearance would accommodate the rooftop cargo rack of a family leaving home with everything they could carry and not expecting to return. They did not know any of this. They were not supposed to know. The plan was complete. The infrastructure was built into the landscape around them. The knowledge was held by civil defense coordinators whose names appeared in no public directory. And the roads remained exactly as they had been designed, wide enough, clear enough, straight enough, strong enough for a morning that came close several times and, in the end, never arrived. They are still there. You may have driven them this week.